This topic is called slow moving. It is really a presentation to help those of us who get stuck in phase 1 or phase 3 CVI. When students seem to be kind of in a certain place, they scored a certain place in phase 1 or phase 3 CVI, and we don't kind of know how to get them to the next spot. So let's talk for a moment about the phase 1 behaviors. Just as a reminder that in phase 1, the student functions with inconsistency in their attention on visual targets. They require support from the environment in terms of visual competition, auditory competition, even touch, even olfactory. In other words, any additional sensory input could actually distract the child or cease that process of looking. In phase 1, we remember that the student generally requires significant supports in order to use their vision. They often require single color objects that are often of a preferred color. Now, not all children with CVI will have a preferred color, but single color is still critical. Objects that produce movement or are shiny, because we remember that shiny things are interpreted by the brain as kind of a supercharged movement. Objects that are presented against a simple background, not like the background you see behind me, but something very plain and generally black, because black is light absorbing. And objects that are familiar because of the confound and the difficulty that students with CVI have with visual novelty. So how should interventions be designed? So if a student is stuck in phase 1, here's some thoughts just to remind us about how those interventions can be designed. First of all, we want to try to incorporate the principles into routines of the day as feasible. And in phase 1, the use of functional vision is less flexible because the student does require such specialized environments. It could happen perhaps in meal routines or leisure routines, in bathing or grooming routines, fine motor, gross motor, and even O&M. But what if the student doesn't seem to be visually attending? Well, if we still say, and I do actually talk with individuals, with professionals, with paraprofessionals, with family members who will say, I just don't think we can even see any visual responses. Well, let's first evaluate the issues pertaining to visual latency and field preferences. That often in phase 1, the student's latency is so prolonged and so pronounced that when you present a target, however long you think it takes for the child to notice that target, double it or triple it, because your ability to actually wait long enough may be much, much more fragile than the need the student in phase 1 has. So often latency is a huge roadblock for that child showing visual attention, especially when the child initiates that process, when they first are in a situation where you're asking them to look at something and they haven't been looking for a while. That latency can be really prolonged. Also look at visual field preferences. So when I do the CVI range, I always start with, when I do the face-to-face part, the direct assessment portion, I always begin with the visual fields. I always do a modified confrontation technique, because if I don't really know where the child sees best, how am I going to know whether the child is able to respond or whether they simply aren't even accessing that information? So I have to really figure out really clearly, where does this child see things? So let's say, for example, you present something to a student who, and you present it on a tabletop or on their wheelchair tray, but they have significant lower field issues and you're not aware of that. You know, you can't really assume the child's not looking if they're not even perceiving something is there. It's not a choice at that point. It's simply inaccessible. So by doing the field preference evaluation, we get a much better sense of where these things should be presented. So latency and fields are a couple things to really think about. Also in phase 1, so critical that we think about the environment. This is the time in which the environment is the most impacting. Ask yourself, are people talking? Are there lights on? I am thinking about a child I saw this week who really nothing was going to happen with him until I turned the overhead lights off, because he just stared at the overhead lights the entire time they were on. So I have to, assume that. Very often, in terms of the first bullet, I will ask people directly, can we just have a little bit of quiet for a few moments and see if that makes a difference for this child to notice something. We're also going to analyze whether there's too much pattern or color on the target. So not every target is going to be appropriate. And as we know, individuals with CVI usually require single color objects initially so that they can form a stable visual image of that object, load it into their memory, and hopefully retrieve it when that object is presented again. If the target is too patterned, then we have no idea whether the child is perceiving, the black and white check part of that toy, or the stripe part of the toy, or the polka dot part of the toy. And rather than seeing it as an entire single object, for them it appears as a series of fragile, ever-changing patterns. So that color and the degree of pattern on the target is also something to take a look at. Also, very important to look at the background array. Is there too much visual clutter or information in the background? I recently spent some time in a state where one of the teachers of the visually impaired showed how he took a photograph of a classroom, and he took a photograph of an angle of the classroom, and he asked people that he was presenting this information to, he asked them to count the number of targets that they saw. Count every book, every toy, every object, every spoon, every teacher's notebook, everything they saw. And literally in one image in a classroom, in a typical preschool classroom, there were hundreds of things in the image. Then he asked them to count again once he reduced the visual background, once he used some black background and actually occluded much of that visual clutter. And what they saw was that the child was able to respond when the number of targets reduced dramatically. These things make a big difference. The next thing we want to also take a look at is the student position. That if this individual is not securely positioned, then they may have to devote much of their energy and attention to the sense of security that they may feel or may not feel against gravity. That if a child is worried that they're going to fall out of their chair, or that they're going to lose head control, or that they are in a sort of fragile state physically, it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to divert their attention, especially in phase 1, to visual attention. We want to see as a student in one position too long. That's another one of the issues that we sometimes don't think about enough. If you consider, anybody who has to spend a lot of time in airplanes like I do may think about this thing that is always just a torture to me, which is, how long is this flight? How long am I going to be stuck in this small place where I cannot move very well, and I certainly don't have much independence of movement or variety of movement, that when I get to move, those are kind of like precious moments, because you certainly can't ask the people in the row to get up, 3 times in a half hour. And it's it almost sort of takes up all of your attention after a while. Well, so too, our students who are frequently in a position that they have no control over may be so uncomfortable and so need a position change that also may be one of the challenges we should look at. Again, PTs, OTs, people on the child's team will be extraordinarily helpful in this process. Also analyze, is most energy diverted to maintaining that position rather than engaging with the world? And that is often a significant concern. So for those students in phase 1, or for students who are very medically fragile or neurologically fragile, there are some signs that can tell us a student is actually getting stressed. And these are actually borrowed from what we know about the behaviors of very fragile infants. That when we see things like hiccuping or yawning, gaze avoidance, or even light gazing, those can be not only signs that the child, has an air bubble for hiccuping, or that they're tired for yawning, but those are also classic signs of neurologic stress. those are signs that we need to change something, that the child needs to either be given some time without interaction, or possibly repositioned, or have less complexity of the environment available. Some children will sleep. That you'll hear and maybe have even experienced, that when you go to a home or a classroom to see a child, that the parent may say, every time you come, he falls asleep. That may not be a coincidence. It may be that the amount of sensory input that you bring to that task may actually require the child to organize themselves on a much lower level of alertness. And sometimes sleeping isn't really for re-energizing as much as it is for avoiding something that's overly complex. Facial grimacing is another sign that a child may be stressed or fatigued. Hand or finger extension, when you see those fingers flail and you see the child just almost, you can see the tension in their hands. Again, we even see this in premature babies, that they will splay their fingers, and that can also be a sign that they are very overstimulated. And then some reflexive laughing, those high-pitched vocalizations or laughs that come sometimes not as sounds of joy, but as sounds of stress. We should be aware of those. I think if you don't know what that vocalization means, my suggestion is that you ask the parent, because they most likely will. So if after all of that the student still isn't responding, then what? Well, think about these guidelines. That when students are sort of stuck in phase one of the first things I want to know after the CVI range score is how often, what are the circumstances in which this child has opportunities to use their vision. That if it's kind of restricted to vision time, where the child they're taken into a separate little area of the classroom, or even a different area outside the classroom, or maybe it's a time when the bathroom in the classroom is dark, and we do this thing with a lighted object or something shiny, and we do it for 10 minutes once a day, or even less often, you would not have the expectation, you should not have the expectation of improved vision. That vision improves based on a number of principles, including frequency. So frequency is important. You may want to consider redesigning the environment in favor of a reduction of stimuli. And this sounds like the easiest thing to do, but it is actually a very challenging thing. And it is something that the classroom manager, the teacher, the person who's really the head of the team, the parent, has to demand. That if it's a time when you're asking this child to use their vision, and they can only do it if the background is really controlled, then that's how it has to be, at least some periods in the day. I actually think that will benefit all the members of the classroom, by the way, even the adults. Try setting up favorite or best judgment objects for longer periods of time. So maybe that's one of the issues, is that that the child is maybe on the changing table in the bathroom, and you have something suspended and a light on it, and it has movement and it doesn't make noise, and the child doesn't look, and 30 seconds go by, and maybe 60 seconds go by. It may be helpful to give that child more time. And one of the ways that I kind of describe this as the next bullet that I see on these slides, which is not to hover. That for a student in phase one, they usually require more time than we have patience for. So my suggestion is set that target up in the correct environment, sit by being quietly available, and monitor, because the child's need to look away, maybe look a little longer, look away, is actually much greater than maybe your patience is waiting for the child to actually accomplish that visual task or response. So what if another challenge that can occur in phase one is, what if there is no favorite object or color? Sometimes a child shows so little visual behavior that people say, I don't know what this child looks at. I have not seen anything that he's looked at. Or they may say, well, I've not seen a color that makes a difference. So in terms of color, I suggest that you create kind of a first set and a first sort of launching pad. And I would say that if a child doesn't show preferred color because they don't look at anything yet, then assign a color, because what we're going to try to do is build in some consistency in responses. And so I often think of red as a good kind of reference because red is such a visually exciting color neurologically. But if there are other logical choices from the child's own learning or living environment, then that's fine. For example, there was a child whose video I watched recently, and when I watched this child's video, I noticed that her bedroom was pink, that there was a pink pattern wallpaper on one wall, her crib was pink, she was wearing a pink outfit, her mobile was pink. I don't think it was a stretch to guess that pink would be the color we would start with for her. Also, assign 3 to 5 objects that make sense for the child. So in phase 1, remember the object has to be single color, have movement, paired with light, non-noisy, presented in the child's best field, and against a plain background. These can be things that should be matched to the child's age. I probably wouldn't pick Elmo if the student was 12 years old. But I might pick a Slinky, which has a more neutral kind of age consideration. A reflective windsock or a pinwheel, it could be Elmo, or it could be a mobile made out of silverware. Something, come up with something that is that vision, that place where you're just building visual responses that can at least be considered to be brought forward as a child gets into phase 2. And then provide ample opportunities for repeat exposure under appropriate conditions. Again, I'll just reiterate this, that I know I say it frequently, that we want to think about this as an approach and as an overlay to things a child's doing to the greatest extent possible. We want to avoid sort of the vision time or vision therapy model. Rather, we're thinking of this as an overlay to opportunities throughout the day. I also talk about avoiding using flashlights as a standalone target, because that is not, it's intended to be paired with a target the child eventually can interact with. Avoid presenting materials that cannot be linked to new or functional activities. So the reason that I don't ever just sit a child in front of a light box is that I don't think just looking at a flashlight or a light box is something that is eventually going to lead to vision plus function. But if I pair that pinwheel with a light, if I put something on the light box that has movement that the child eventually will interact with, that may be more helpful. So simply putting a color overlay on a light box doesn't feel like it's going to be easy to launch into phase 2 from that. Avoid changing materials without observing or reassessing the student. We want to make sure that when we add the new things that we have a real rationale for that. So I hope that helped with phase 1. The phase 3 behaviors are another place where people get stuck, where they say, well, you know, this child scores on the CVI range at 7, and that's great, and that's, you know, really to be celebrated. But then how do you get beyond 7? Well, let's again back up and talk about what some of those behaviors are in phase 3. In phase 3, the student functions visually in most tasks. So the same child who was in phase 1, you must imagine that child traveling to phase 3, because almost every child who gets to phase 3 began in phase 1. And now this child who started out barely showing a visual response now functions visually in almost all tasks. It seems like their vision's kind of on and active, though not always interpreting things the way we would imagine. In phase 3, the student demonstrates visual curiosity. This is a student who might come into a room and move right over to something that's on the window sill, or might, you know, walk up to something and try to open the drawer, open the door. They show curiosity in their environment. They generally have functional fields. Even if they are not fully resolved, their visual fields have improved dramatically, knowing that lower visual fields seem to be particularly difficult. They often have either a visually directed reach part of the time, or it's emerging nicely. They now can use information in 2 dimension, but will have difficulties with complexity. Distance viewing may exist now beyond 10 to 15 feet, and those highly complex environments, especially new environments, will still continue to impact that child's vision. In phase 3, the students generally require a reduction of information when things are in 2D, or even in many environments. So we can use occluders or window cards to help eliminate some of that extra detail. This is where we also might highlight or outline critical or salient features of symbols or pictures, and I'll show an example of that in a moment that we can talk about. That the student in phase 3 still may have significant difficulty in novel or overstimulating environments. This is really important to remember because a lot of students who require orientation and mobility may be assessed only in the familiar environment, which is really not the way to properly assess a child for O&M. But if that happens, you'll see a very different picture of a student compared to the child, that same child in a novel environment. That it may be necessary to highlight landmarks, just as we highlight the salient features of targets in 2D, we may have to actually highlight landmarks in the real physical environment as well. Sometimes the individual will need assistance from an adult or a peer because of their complexity difficulties in a novel setting, and many children with CVI will actually go on to use a cane, some with a weighted tip. So instruction in phase 3 for pre-academic or academic students can focus on metacognitive strategies which help the student kind of think about their own thinking. This has to do with the principles of salient features, so that when an individual with CVI encounters a new image, they actually hopefully have stored in their memory what the definition of these targets are, so that they can actually problem solve it. I'll show an example in a moment, but if we play this out all the way to literacy, we can imagine a child with CVI being asked how to describe or show us or match how a letter D and a letter B are alike and how they're different. To say in the Cat in the Hat book that we know this is Sally because she has the salient feature of the red bow in her hair. The two big themes in phase 3 are to actually develop comparative thought, sometimes associated with sorting activities initially, and have this comparative language that where we talk about how, yes, this letter A does look like a letter D, except that the line is much shorter. The line on the letter A stops right where the circle stops, but on the letter D, it's much taller. In other words, showing a child how things are alike and different to help incorporate comparative language into interactions and instruction. So I'm looking at a slide that shows a picture on an iPad or tablet device in which there's a photographic picture of a cat, and it's been imported into a drawing program so that on top of the cat, an adult or the child themselves can actually indicate the salient features by using red and outlining, oh, that's a cat because I see the triangle ears, and outlining also the whiskers, which help indicate that. The second theme is to be able to locate these salient features against increasingly complex backgrounds. But as the child is finding these salient features, they're not only building their cognition and supporting their language and supporting learning and generalizing these tasks to more things, they're actually using more ventral stream or detail vision, which is helping to build acuity in the brain. Phase 3 is a very complex place. So if we think about, for example, I kind of use the example of a Highlights for Children magazine, always has a hidden pictures exercise in it. That's one way that children who are typically developing or have typical vision may actually have fun looking for the salient features of, let's say, banana, which is hidden in among a bunch of leaves that have a similar shape. But because the child can discriminate, can compare the actual shape of a banana as different from the shape of those leaves, the child is successful in finding the hidden picture. In order to find salient features, we may start with an actual three-dimensional target. So if we're talking about Clifford the big red dog, for example, the actual physical object. Then maybe we're going to sort of show Clifford in a pop-up book where we're using movement and dimensionality to help him notice. We're going to talk about Clifford as an image on an iPad or other tablet device where backlighting helps support visual attention. We might make an adapted book in which we get rid of some of the background so that Clifford and his salient features sort of pop and we don't have to deal with that background information. Working our way back into a less adapted book so that more detail can come back in, then finding variations on Clifford like baby Clifford, who looks very much like regular Clifford but is slightly different. We can also generalize this to specific actions or details. Let's find the Clifford that's holding a basketball. Let's find the Clifford that's pushing the lawnmower. Let's find the Clifford that's sleeping. So now again, we're looking at how Cliffords can vary, but they still meet the salient feature. And then finally, matching Cliffords based on a specific detail. All the Cliffords that are eating can go in this pile. In other words, reinforcing and using mixed approaches to help the child solve that problem. Another issue that some children get stuck with in phase 3 is distance viewing. This is how a child first can learn basic information about a setting. We can ask the student to locate specific details that are highlighted. So for example, I may take a photographic image of an environment and see if the child can find that detail. Let's see if you can find the, there's a flag that always hangs outside this building, or there's a flagpole that indicates we're right outside the post office. Let's look at the picture and see if you can find it in a photograph. Then I'll take the photo from a little further away and see if the child can still find the flag and the flagpole with more detail. I will then have the child go to that environment and see if they can then find the target that they were able to find in sort of a sitting down, isolated task in the environment in general. I'm also going to use maps to help teach a child to think about their orientation in space and the steps and the key features they will encounter as they move from place to place. So it's not enough just to move through space. The child really needs to create like a visual and cognitive map that way, and then to slowly increase the distance of those targets. This is a process that I have found that distance viewing does not seem to really improve unless we create opportunities for the child to use their vision at greater distances. I also talk a lot about how children who are engaged in physical therapy or other movement-based activities should ideally always have a target to move toward. That most of us who ambulate are going somewhere most of the time. We hardly ever just spin in space. But when you look at children and gait trainers, if they have CVI and sometimes other vision difficulties, you may see a lot of that moving in circles because the child has not been able to visually identify a target in the distance to move toward. So from the very beginning, well before the child gets to phase 3, the incorporation of a suspended beach ball, or maybe there's a switch that lights up, and when the child gets to the switch that's 5 or 6 or so feet away, they can hit it and it plays a song that tells them they're all done. Or maybe it's incorporated with some other intrinsically rewarding object that they are trying to reach. This is where putting bits of like a mylar fringy curtain in a doorway might help a child orient to that door from a greater distance. We're going to apply these principles then to activities of daily life, to symbol systems and communication systems, to reading, which may include sight words, math, and social cues. That these principles of salient features, of distance, of increasing levels of background complexity really need to be considered over the span of the child's day. And again, remembering that a student's visual function may be affected by stress, overstimulation, too great a degree of novelty, health, or hunger. That does not mean, by the way, that a child with CVI has vision that varies from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day. It means that just like you, just like me, that when we are very stressed, when we are very fatigued, that we are not always at our sort of visual top place. I'm not going to read War and Peace after driving 300 miles home from a trip, because I will be fatigued. We should not have a different expectation for students with CVI who can be stressed by the routines of their day as well. So the takeaway messages are these. In terms of getting stuck, the following things might be helpful. That remember that progress is expected. So staying at a certain CVI range score for years is not usual. It is not what we would expect. That frequency of opportunity is critical. That integrating this, infusing this throughout the day is critical. Remember that the environment has a huge impact on visual function, especially in phase 1 and early phase 2. And finally, that it's often necessary to create an intentional, what I call CVI schedule, in which we literally gather the team together and plan where we're going to make these adaptations for use of vision throughout the day. Thank you. I hope this has been helpful.